AFRODAD's AFROMEDI II. Ladies and gentlemen of the media fraternity, this is the second installation of our AFRODAD Media Initiative that we launched last year amidst very complicated circumstances. Since then, though, the world has changed quite dramatically. Many of you will have recalled when we launched this initiative around this time last year, there were only Kenyans in the room, and the rest of the continent was represented on the screen there and the screen there because of the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant that as a fraternity of journalists who thrive on being in or at the center of where the action is happening, were confined to the limitations of a computer screen and to the powers of the internet and Zoom in order to stay with us for the entire week during that initiative. But since then, the world has changed, and we're now here together, and it is wonderful to see such a wonderful representation of the continent in the room, but also online at the different national level events, and also on Facebook and YouTube. Secondly, a year ago, when we launched this initiative, we as civil society organizations across the world, but specifically on the continent, as AFRODAD, had been warning of a debt crisis that was going to shock the continent and that was going to be accelerated due to the vagaries of the pandemic. This because the economic order has maintained its neoliberal approach in trying to privatize the delivery of public services and has pushed the agenda of debt financing development. Distinguished participants, for those of you who arrived in Nairobi over the weekend would have seen Nairobi is a bit of a construction site, right? I don't know how many of you would agree with me. There's tractors, trucks, road diversions, and a lot of construction that is happening, and which to the naked eye looks beautiful. Some of my colleagues who have not been to Nairobi in many years were amazed and were telling me about how there's no potholes in Nairobi. And I said to them, I wish I knew which part of Nairobi that was, because where I live, there are plenty of potholes. And my poor car suffers every time I try and drive. But the wonders of that infrastructure that you're observing as you come in, even just here, as John mentioned, there's a national museum just being built next to us, comes at a cost that we call debt, and a cost that we call debt financing, which means our government is borrowing a lot of money to finance that infrastructure. And why this is important is because there's another story to be told about this development, and the story that you as journalists here in the room and on the screen and on YouTube and Facebook need to tell. And that is the story of how these infrastructure projects are being financed. The general public are not necessarily fully aware of how our governments negotiate the financing arrangements. They are not necessarily aware about how the cost of paying for these infrastructure investments are going to be done. And I will use that as an example. The road that you saw as you came up from the airport that's being constructed, they are installing what we call toll gates. And that means that a road user who wants to access that road will need to pay to use that road. And what that means in reality for the general public is that if I want to access what is considered a public good and that should have been provided by the government, I have to pay for it. And that payment is not only going to the government in the form of a tax or a toll fee, it's also going to the private contractor that has been used to construct that road or to build that road. And throughout this week, my colleagues will take us through some of those issues. And so that is the second thing that has changed since we met 1 year ago. The landscape, the debt crisis that AFRODAD and many other organizations, civil society organizations, had been warning about. Similarly, third, when we last met, there were very few debt initiatives or debt relief initiatives that were being discussed to help support developing countries across the world, but specifically here in Africa, to deal with the dangers and the vagaries of the COVID-19 crisis that had led to challenges with their revenue mobilization, the continued debt servicing, as well as protecting citizens and local businesses from the impacts of COVID-19. Since then, we've seen a number of debt initiatives, such as the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. We've seen the Group of 20, which is the largest 20 economies in the world, come up with something called the Common Framework on the Treatment of Debt, and we'll go through that this week. We have seen from the IMF the largest allocation of what they call the special drawing rights, which is a special currency, a reserve currency that is available and accessible to all members of the International Monetary Fund, up to the tune of $650 billion US dollars. But take note, each of these initiatives has a story to be told. And not a story of success, but a story of where Africa lies in the hierarchy of needs when there are global crises. Distinguished members of the Fourth Estate, these debt relief initiatives have actually, to some extent, made the debt crisis on this continent potentially worse. And I'll give you an example. The Debt Service Suspension Initiative ended in December 2021. And as the name suggests, it was just a suspension, not a cancellation, not a stop. It was a suspension. As of January 2022, these debt servicing has had to resume, which means on top of the borrowing that our governments on the continent took to support and protect their economies during COVID-19, they now have to think about resuming the debt servicing that had been suspended for 2 years. The G20 Common Framework that I've referred to has been riddled with challenges because some of our creditors, that is the lenders, do not want to join it because they feel that it is a way of not getting their money back. So private creditors in particular, who have refused to join this common framework and sit down with our governments and negotiate a proper common debt relief and comprehensive package, means it's very difficult. Still, within the common framework, we've got countries like Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia who have signed up to this initiative but are still struggling because their creditors don't want to come to the table and negotiate. Third, with the 650 billion that was issued through special drawing rights, only 33 billion came to Africa. And we are 54 countries, or 55 African countries. So I know you may not all be mathematicians, but I think that is simple maths. And you can figure out if 650 billion was issued and our entire continent just got 33 billion, there's something wrong. That is the other story why AFROMEDI was launched. It is to tell that African story. It is to tell the story about why Africa as a continent, why Africans as citizens are always kept at the back of the queue when it comes to dealing with crises. And this is why we have launched, and we did launch last year, this AFROMEDI, and why we felt it was important to have a second edition of it here in person. And thankfully, COVID has reduced and has allowed us to meet in person so that we can also get your experiences of what it is like to report about these very, very important issues. Not only because it's important to tell the human aspect, but it is important to tell the political aspect about Africa's agency as a continent and as a people. You are also comrades in the fight for economic, social, and political justice for this continent of ours. Your expertise in being able to tell the story, your expertise in being able to access political power, because our politicians love you people. They always invite you for nice press briefings and press conferences when they are doing their events, when they are doing their political rallies. It is an opportunity for you to ask them these questions and start telling that story. When you go out there outside of the continent to speak to international leaders, ask them why about African agency and Africa's agency. Why can't we have the same power? When we talk about partnerships, many of you may have covered the EU-AU summit of a few weeks ago, and they talk about equal and renewed partnership. But yet, when you think about vaccines, when you think about trade, we're still at the back of the line. They still want to donate vaccines to Africa. They don't want to give us the waiver to make the vaccines on this continent. That is the story. That is what AFROMEDI is about. Right? That is why we're here together, to bring us all together and to be able to tell that story. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very excited that we are having a second edition of this AFROMEDI, and that Fidelite and the rest of my colleagues here have done a splendid job in actually increasing the number of countries that are participating in the second edition of this AFROMEDI. And it is my sincere and utter belief and hope we're all going to have fun. I think for many of us, it's the first time we've boarded a plane in 2 years or 3 years. So I hope the experience was enjoyable. I do hope the next 2.5 days is going to be exciting. Ask as many questions. Challenge us as AFRODAD, because that is our job also, for you as media, to challenge civil society and ask us the hard questions so that we may also improve in how we provide our information, in how we provide our advocacy, and in how we provide the analysis, so that we can continue to build Africa's agency as citizens. We are all citizens of this continent at the end of the day, and everything that our leaders do affect us, whether we live in Nairobi, in Lome, in Yaoundé, in Harare, in Lusaka, in Kampala. We are all African citizens. And that is the most important thing that matters as journalists. That is the story we would love for you to tell your readers. What we would love for you to give to your viewers on television and other platforms. And so with those few remarks, distinguished members of the Fourth Estate, I've also called you comrades because you are comrades. And on behalf of the Board of Directors of AFRODAD, our partners, and to my colleagues who have put this together, I want to welcome you to AFROMEDI, the second edition.